Welcome everyone to the first lecture video for CSC-3083 Technology and Society. I am Dr. Robloff. Just as a reminder, you can contact me at any time by sending me email at michael.robloff@nvnu.edu. If you need to drop by my office, feel free to do so. It's in the lower level of the library inside of the 37 office, and specifically my office is 27. And I will have a door schedule eventually posted, both on Moodle and on my door, of when you can come visit me in person. Although, for purposes of this term, the university has asked everyone to try to do these office visits remotely when possible. Right? I can go either way. I will take appropriate measures if you do drop by the office so that we can have a safe visit. If none of my traditional office times work out for you, either in person or virtually, just suggest some other time and we'll see what we can do about it. Right? So, to begin, let's look at a little bit of scripture here. So, Deuteronomy 30:19-20. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. God gives us basically a choice: life or death, blessings or curses. Technology is, in the same vein, a blessing or a curse. It depends on how we choose to use it or how we choose to let it shape our lives. You know, in computers, it's just one form of many types of technology, right? They have become ubiquitous in our society. They're everywhere. They're hidden and they're in plain sight, and we don't think a whole lot about them nowadays, right? And computers have had an incredible impact on society. Their significance is undeniable, right? There's often this sort of give and take between technology and society. One influences the other, and the other is influenced by the first, right? And there's this feedback cycle that occurs. I don't think one exists independently of the other. And this is a theme that we explore in depth in the GPS version of this course, essentially. It's more of a for non-majors, and we take a little bit different approach to how we look at various topics, not from the computing professional standpoint, but just from a general individual standpoint of how technology plays a role in their life. So, given all that, I just want to really recap what I want you to get out of this course. I want you to become informed about major technological developments. I want you to be able to explain their impact on society, individuals, social groups, countries, nations, institutions. I want you to be able to evaluate the effects of technology in society and just formulate ethical arguments. Yes, informed by a Christian worldview, of course. I mean, you don't go through this institution without having that worldview built and shaped around you and your entire being. And that influences how you will see technology and how it impacts your view of it with respect to how you utilize it, to how you share it with others, to how you decide to use it to build new and exciting things as a computing professional. I want you to keep in mind that this course is supposed to help you develop skills in articulating issues that arise from the use of technology. I want you to be able to explain the reasons and behind the decisions for your use of a particular technology, or why you're advocating that the organization that you're a part of should adopt a particular type of technology or build an entirely new one. Maybe you're helping to build that new technology. You need to justify ethically why that's a good thing or not a good thing to do. And I want you to work on practicing your ability to communicate those thoughts to others in your organization. It's I went into this in greater depth in the syllabus overview, but being able to explain to individuals who aren't computing professionals, or explaining to other computing professionals who are from different faiths or don't have any particular faith, or maybe they're atheists or agnostic, or to explain to folks who have a different political philosophy. You need to find ways to share common ground, right? Because you're a part of an organization that has a set of shared objectives. And even though you come from different backgrounds and have different views, it's still important to find a way to move forward on issues, right? To find that common ground whenever it's possible. And I think if we all stretch and we're all willing to give a little, we don't have to violate our core tenets, our core beliefs that we hold, our faith that we hold in many cases, and we can find a compromise that works with others, as long as they're also willing to give someone the issue. Sometimes we do have to agree to disagree. I've mentioned that before. And we have to take a position, and we have to accept the consequences of our positions, right? So we may have a freedom to speech, we have a freedom to assembly, we have lots of freedoms, but we don't have a freedom from consequences. And consequences can be good, they can be bad. The point is, we have to be willing to accept them for the positions that we take. And I hope you don't modify your positions on certain issues just because you're afraid of accepting the consequences of taking a view that you wholeheartedly feel deep down inside of you, right? I think that's something that could be disappointing to God. It's important for you to hold fast to the views that you have embraced, sometimes there's a fine line between compromise and find a common position and just outright crossing the line and compromising your own views. And obviously we don't want that for you and as you move forward in your life, both professionally and privately. So this course is different from other computer science courses. There's no code to write. There's no systems to debug. We want you to learn about how to differentiate between knowledge and wisdom, right? Knowledge, facts, pieces of information. People have taken, knowledge and just ran with it time and time again throughout history. Just because we can build something doesn't mean that we should build something, right? Wisdom is knowing if and when it's appropriate to build a technology or utilize a technology. To what extent do we utilize a given technology? Is it appropriate for us to utilize one technology in conjunction with another, right? What are the safeguards that we can impose on building a new technology or using an existing one that will create a better experience for all? How do we maybe more progressively introduce or build a new technology in a safer manner? Those types of things, right? And I want you to kind of hone in on the use of that wisdom, right? But therefore the focus will be primarily on computer information technology because you are becoming computer professionals, right? This is you're in a computer science curriculum, so the focus is going to be on those areas of technology, right? Computing technologies and networking technologies, information technologies, and for the most part, we may kind of veer off here and there a little bit, but not too much, right? Again, that GPS course that I teach on technology and society does tend to be more broad in scope of evaluating technology than we would in this sort of computer science ethics centered course, right? Alright, so Proverbs 18:2. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. So, when we advocate for a position, when we debate a particular position, we need to try to seek understanding, and a lot of that involves becoming really good listeners. Not just saying the first thing that comes to your mind. To really, truly embrace understanding, to develop wisdom and insight into things, it helps us to be good listeners, to listen and consider the position of what the other person is saying, to literally walk a mile in their shoes, right? To try to be empathetic to their position, their cause, and how they're approaching life, right? And it's a very difficult thing to do, to build that empathy, to try to understand another person's issue. And that runs both ways, no matter what your position is politically on things or socially on issues. To try to put yourself in that other person's shoe is a hard thing, but it's an important thing to do. Because otherwise, you will probably end up saying things that you regret, right? That's being the fool, right? When you say things and after the fact you're like, I shouldn't have did that. That wasn't good on my part. I regret that. I don't want you to be in that position. So, and certainly in a professional environment, I want you to be in that position. All right. So, this is a serious course with serious issues that we discuss, and they deserve serious consideration. I want you to be prepared to read, think, discuss, right? Very critically so. Sometimes laughter is welcome, right? Humor is not in conflict with serious consideration of issues. God gave us humor and laughter and comedy. Very much a believer in that. We have to be wise in the use of humor and laughter and trying to find that common ground. We got to be careful that what we do is not something that belittles someone else or brings someone else down. We have to, but we can't be completely dry and completely serious all the time, right? Or overly self-deprecating of ourselves, right? That diminishes the gifts that God has given us and the impact that God has made in our lives. So, it's like everything; it's in moderation, right? I tend to be a little snarky at times. I come from a family where we maybe tend to be a little too snarky at times, and we have to work on that. So, and I have been that way at times in the past, and so that's something I have to work on and grow. So, right. And this is an in-depth course, right? We read to understand, we read critically. We want to think deeply about the issues. We don't want to go just stop at the surface level considerations of an issue. We want to dive deeper into something. And that's hard to do. It's hard to really critically assess a position, our own position, someone else's position, to find holes in our position or someone else's position, to do it in a professional way, and to be honest about those shortcomings. Right? Doesn't mean you abandon those just because you find some shortcomings in your position, or you try to get someone else to be in their position. No, you're respectful of those positions, and hopefully they're respectful of your position. But it helps to grow in the strength and convictions of your positions, and in some cases maybe be willing to change them, be open to changing them. There's nothing wrong with that. If it's informed, if it's in depth, you've been serious about it, you've been in prayer about it, it's okay to change your position on something and change it several times, and maybe at some point you can back up where you started, and that's okay too. That's part of the journey. We do want to examine things from a Christian worldview. We are at a Christian institution. And we want to try to put that framework around issues whenever it's possible. I'm not. If you bring discussions from some other faith, from other religious texts, from a secular text or secular philosophy, I'm not going to penalize you for that. That's fine. Others may bring in a Christian worldview. I just ask you to be respectful of discussions of applying a Christian worldview to our discussion of topics, right? If and when they do come into being. So, that's all. All right. And this class can be informal. This particular recording is sort of a more lecture-focused discussion. It's a little bit more formal and serious, right? But the course itself, when we meet in person or virtually through Zoom, or when we do so in our synchronous sessions, I want us to realize it's a discussion-based time. It can be informal, right? And there's some structure to it. Like I have a rigor to how we're going to look at the reading assignments, and we're going to highlight important things that everyone found from the reading assignments. I'm going to present a group class discussion. We'll have breakouts in person and or in Zoom, and we'll figure out how that'll work, and then we'll come back together to kind of discuss, the positions that we've taken or been assigned to take on an issue, and discuss using ethical foundations what our position is on various issues. So, all right, course expectations. Defend. Prepare to defend or support your opinion on or position on an issue. A mere statement is not enough. Don't just state something. Don't try to be neutral on something necessarily. It's okay to see both sides of an issue, but sometimes I want you to take defend or support an opinion. It may or may not be the one that you hold. Keep that in mind. I may want you to take a position that is hard for you to defend or support. And I want you to see that other side of the issue and be able to advocate for that issue. It's part of building that empathy for other groups. All right. I don't want you to. Now, I may be Switzerland in the classroom, right? Because I want to try to go out of my way not to, as much as I can, not to project my political views, my social takes on various topics. I do have political views. I do have social takes. I do have a particular Christian worldview on topics. All right. I do have opinions about things, but I'm going to try as much as I can to keep myself as neutral as possible and to play devil's advocate both ways. Right? So maybe I'm successful most of the time. Maybe I fall on my face with it sometimes. Just be aware of that. I will do my best day in, day out to do that, and some days I'll be okay with it. Some days I may struggle with it, and that's okay. Feel free to provide that feedback in the exit ticket. If you felt like I was being a little too political one way or the other from your particular views, I should be a little bit more neutral. If you don't like me being so neutral, I guess you could say that too. I could advocate or argue for a position, I guess, on occasion myself. All right, defend. I want you to be prepared to, I just said that. I want you to think critically. I want you to develop, enhance, and utilize your ability to think critically and not be reflexive about things. Right? I want you to be practical. Through your readings, your thinking, and your discussions. They should impact you and how you will use and participate in development technology. The whole point of this course is for you to come out as computing professionals thinking about the ramifications of your use and building of technologies. You are building the future, right, in the present. That has an impact on people, right? You may think, I couldn't possibly have any sort of impact. I'm just, little old me. No, you will have an impact, right? Your software or your contributions within the information technology group of an organization will have an impact on people, not just your coworkers or your managers, but your customers, your clients, your people affected by the outreach of your organization. If it's a nonprofit, it will impact people, and that can be a good impact or a bad impact. And most of the time you'll make the right choices, sometimes you won't, and that's a learning experience. But I want you to try to have as many of those learning experiences and to think critically about it now, so you have fewer regretful situations later on in life. And to be honest, no one has no regrets. All right, at least I don't think so. I think you go through life and you try the best that you can. And there are some things that you just say, boy, I wish I could have did that better. I wish I could interact with that person better. I wish I could have not just let that technology kind of run amok from our organization. I wish I would have said something about it. Right. I want you to be respectful. I want you to listen to the opinions and positions of others. And I want you to observe the golden rule, right? And I want you to, listen, not just even listen. I want you to exhibit Christ's love towards others. I want you to, go a step above even just listening. And just respecting. I want you to exhibit Christ's love towards others. And really go out of your way to be empathetic to the other person's position. And that's hard to do. I understand that. Right. And we need to be supportive. We need to respect those other class members, whether you agree or disagree with their positions. if someone says, I could see myself working in a company that would make, smart armaments, right? Because I'm a patriot and I want our country has the best possible technology so that we can defend our homeland and advocate for our worldview around the world. Other people will say, well, how can you do that? Your technologies could kill and maim innocents, could cause horrendous ecological and infrastructure damage. Why would you do that? Why would you be a party of that? You would say, well, I want to do that because as war is always a part of humanity's history and will continue to be, and I think I can play a role in minimizing the loss of life and the loss of innocence. It could be the comeback, right? So that's a very controversial type of topic and position to take. And but each of those two positions, the person advocating for one versus the person advocating for the other, needs to be respectful of that other person. So, okay. I kind of went through a course discussion. There, in our synchronous in-class / remote sessions, there will be a discussion evaluation, and I'm going to be looking to see what level of participation and contributions you're making to this class. The 10 points per class session, I think, is how this is going to go. 5 points for attendance, right? Partial points for arriving late or early. Now, obviously, pandemic measures are in effect. You get sick, you can't attend class, right? It's an excuse absence. Don't worry about it. If you, again, roll out of bed late and stumble onto your Zoom session, if nothing else, I'm going to penalize you a little bit, right? Come after the start of class. I will ask you to turn your cameras on for this particular course, all right? Other courses I understand bandwidth limitations, and I may want you to kind of keep those cameras off. You don't have to. I prefer you keep them turned on so I can see everyone. It's boring to lecture to emptiness, all right? Now, obviously, if you're in class, you're in class on campus. But if you're remote, feel free to turn on that camera, and I encourage you to. Obviously, if you don't want to, in other courses you don't, but here I really want to, because it helps make your contributions more meaningful. You at least have to have a working microphone if your camera isn't working. So, right, and you can also call in. If you are doing remote learning, you can certainly call in. You can use the chat window. If you can't get the internet connection, I guess you'd have to call in, right? And there's a number to call in, and you can participate that way. And if your microphone's busted and your camera's busted, but you can still log in through the internet, you can still type in a chat window. So, I guess there's that too, right? So, all right. So you'll get 5 points for showing up, 2 points for participation. 2's good, 1's minimum, 0's nothing. It's a small component of your all grade, so don't worry too much about how one class may go from another in terms of how I assess that. All right, 1 point for relevance of contribution to topic. Obviously, if our topic is intellectual property and you decide that you want to discuss the latest episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, well, that may be interesting and fascinating to some folks, but it's not going to be really relevant to an discussion of patents or copyrights or trade secrets, right? All right, and clarity of that contribution, right? So when you do talk about patents or trademarks or something like that, you need to be clear in the point that you're trying to make and the supporting details you bring into that discussion. Right. And correctness of reading, yes, it is possible to be wrong about something. If you're conflating intellectual property terms, trying to say that you're talking about copyrights, but you're really discussing aspects of patents, and obviously that wouldn't be that. Or if you were to just say, well, I've become a follower of Christ and I can just have freedom to do whatever I want, right? It doesn't matter what. Well, yeah, it does matter. I got a misreading of scripture, right? So just be aware of that. And everybody needs to participate. This is not. I'm an introvert. I've told you this. I'm an extreme introvert, probably. You know, and Myers-Briggs, assessment. I would definitely be an ISTJ, right? I would, even if you are as much of an introvert as I am, I really need you to participate. Don't be afraid to speak up. I'm not going to make fun of you. I'm not going to belittle you. I'm not going to say that's a shallow or an ill-formed opinion. I'm going to say, I'm going to ask you. I might ask you some probing questions. I'm going to ask you, have you considered A, B, or C? How do you think someone might, what are sort of the shortcomings in your view? Try to get you to kind of explore that. But I'm going to be respectful in how I do that. So I want you to participate. And I expect that out of everyone. I will shut someone down very quickly. If I get a hint that they are laughing at you, that they are making fun of you, they're not being respectful, that they are not demonstrating Christ's love towards you, I will shut that down in a heartbeat. So I want you to feel, free to speak up, right? And obviously, when you do speak up, I mean, there are limits, right? I mean, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. If you start to go off on it, and again, this speaks to whether or not you're demonstrating Christ's love. If you go off on a hate speech-filled rant, or if you go off on some sexist tirade, or something that is obviously just disrespectful and horrible to folks, and maybe it's a personal attack or something, I'm going to shut that down on your part. I'm going to call you out on that. I will call you out respectfully, but I will call you out on that. And because it's done in the context of a class discussion, and then I will follow up with you privately. So, if it's real serious, I have to adjust it right then and there. Gray areas, I might just, ask probing questions and then maybe follow up with you separately. I will try to maintain a respectful situation in the classroom at all times. This is normally something that would apply during a normal semester that's in class. If you're just poking around on your computer to, visit the Steam websites to download a game or play a game, or to chat on I don't know, or archery discus group or something like that. I don't know, or watch videos or something like that while class is going on. That obviously would not be respectful towards others, right? So in that case, I would just not give you any discussion evaluation points and just ask you to leave, right? If you're remote, obviously in this class, I would just, if I felt like there was evidence of that, I would probably just kick you off for the current session. Hopefully I don't have to do that. Hopefully everyone's professional and respectful and all this works. So, and I know that's a lot of really heavy, deep talking points, but I need to drive home the importance of maintaining a civil environment. I think that's really important. It's the only way we get something out of this. And that doesn't mean that even if you have a very progressive philosophy or a very conservative philosophy, that's fine. I think all those viewpoints politically are valid. I think if you, take as long as you can, extreme views can be tolerated to a degree, right? I will try my best to respect that, right? Obviously, again, I just can't have hate speech. I can't have sexist speech. I can't have harassing speech. That hurt others, especially personal attacks. I can't have that. So, but other than that, if you're a progressive, if you're a conservative, you're free to talk up, and everyone is free to offer a counterpoint to something, and I expect you will just respect that. I expect that you'll respect that person. So, all right. So enough of all that. Let's actually get into the material here. So the first chapter is all about the catalyst for change, right? We really are in the midst of the information age, right? So the previous two ages were the industrial age and the rise of manufacturing and mass production and all that sort of stuff. And then we eventually entered into the atomic age, right, with the detonation of the first nuclear weapons and atomic energy and all that sort of stuff, right? It was a very clear-cut change in how our society was. And then, very shortly thereafter, and for the next several decades, right, we had the birth of the computer, right? And although computers, or the notion of computers, can go back several centuries, right, to Pascal and Babbage and that sort of thing, modern computing really only took off in the 30s and the 40s to a little bit more so in the 50s, right? So it's a young profession, right? We haven't even eclipsed 100 years in the more wide-reaching aspects outside of Pascal and Babbage and all that, right? It's a young discipline. We're not the thousands of years old that mathematics is. We don't have 1,000 years of the English language history, right? We don't have, we don't have the legacy that other professions have had. In classical mechanical engineering could be hundreds or thousands of years old, depending on how you take things, right? And so it's a young profession. So we're in this information age now, and it's an era that's characterized by unprecedented access to information. Well, what are those catalysts? Well, low-cost computers, one of them, right? Progressively cheaper and cheaper hardware. Are we reaching a bottoming out point on that? Probably, right? I think we've gotten to a point with modern computing devices, and particularly with mobile computing devices, where we've reached a sort of a low point. In fact, we've seen computing devices, especially in the mobile space, start to get more expensive now, and that's generally because in a lot of cases that brings a lot of increased capability, right? So the costs have increased, but you get a lot more. You had sort of the same capabilities going forward. Indeed, we see that like in mobile devices. The lower and middle end of mobile computing devices are far cheaper now, right? And are much more capable. So we still kind of see this development of lower cost computing devices occurring, right? And the other major catalyst is high-speed communication networks, right? So I grew up as a Gen X individual in an era when there was no internet. There were computers, there were personal computers. I played computer games with my friends and eventually got my own computer. But the communication networks were slow in coming. So in the 80s, they slowly started to emerge. You had bulletin board systems that you could dial into, and there were forums and file sharing and online sort of ASCII games, that sort of thing, real primitive stuff. And sometimes a chat type capability, but not often. And it was dial-up modem, it was slow. And eventually you had these online services like Prodigy and CompuServe and America Online and a few others. And that gave you access to a much larger world of users. And eventually there were tunnels built into the worldwide internet. And along this way, we went from having dial-up connections to permanent connections with various computing technologies, right? Networking technologies. And it just has gotten faster and faster, right? I live among the Amish in Apple Valley, and I can have 100 megabit per second connection now. That's profound. That's amazing. That's transformative. I can even get a halfway decent cellular connection, right, on 4G networks and about 50 megabit per second, connections on a good day, right? I can get high enough in Apple Valley. It's great. It opens up so many capabilities, right? And we have new generations of communication networks that are emerging, that are opening up all sorts of new possibilities, right? So, all right. We'll skip this. this will maybe be a part of our class discussion. This is something I've done in the past. So, let's see here. All right. So, let's think about the intersection of technology and values. So, there's sort of this dynamic between people and technology. People adapt technology. Technology changes society. There's a feedback loop between one and the other. Technology is not the end all and be all that influences society, right? And society does not solely shape technology or the selection of technologies. It can have an influence, it can impact things, it can determine best choice or first choice of technologies, but eventually that technology comes back to influence society as a result, and it changes society, and society changes technology. There's a yin and a yang to it, essentially, right? We use technology in ways that can change people, right? There are physical changes that can occur, right? Laptops will give us portability. There are mental changes that can come from the use of technology, right? Playing an online game can generate dopamine releases in the brain, right? Which can increase your desire to play that game, right? You break some puzzle, you beat some level, you conquer your enemies in some sort of shooter or whatever, right? There's dopamine releases. And consequently, there's the absence of that when you don't achieve some puzzle or something else, right? And that, it's also the same thing for information, right? We live in a society now where we don't have to go to the local library to look everything up in reference volumes, right? We can go online and perform simple searches, and there's a dopamine release. And it changes how we think about information. We don't depend on memorization so much anymore, right? And that can make it problematic in courses, right? Where we all expect you to consume and be able to hold a large volume of information for use in answering questions on exams, when we don't practice that memorization type activity in other situations because of our worldwide networks. And our psychological changes occur in terms of cell phones, right? Cell phones change how we've interacted with people, right? From feature phones that had text messaging, right? This decreased dependence on the use of phone-to-phone calls, to our modern smartphones where we just sent, instant messages or text messages still. We did things in sort of an asynchronous way. And then, of course, the pandemic gave us the ability to do a lot more video chatting, right? It became a lot more popular, particularly on our mobile devices. The traditional phone call has kind of died out, although people still occasionally use it, right? Use it for critical situations. That's sort of the etiquette now, right? You send emails for lower priority items, unless you mark it urgent, I guess. You send text messages or instant messages, right? When you want a little bit speedier response, or it's the normal pace of communication. A phone call, a lot of people tend to regard that as, your pants are on fire. There better be something seriously wrong, right? And that's sort of the change in our psychic of how we look at how we utilize our cell phones, right? And technology solves problems, but they may create new problems too, right? What are some examples, right? The automobile increased our ability to get places much more quickly, right, over horse and buggy. But they created new types of pollution. They caused congestion. They caused us to, instead of living within a city environment and knowing our neighbors, we spend a lot of our days going back and forth over long distances, right, from a suburban area or rural area to a city environment and back and forth. Refrigerator, right? Before that, people had ice boxes, right? They kept a smaller assortment of foods for shorter periods and were more prone to getting sick because things spoiled. Refrigerator let us keep foods for much longer, right? But refrigerators, particularly before the replacement of newer refrigerants, they had the newer refrigerants versus the older one. The older refrigerants caused ozone depletion, right? and it was very harmful to the environment, and they were very energy inefficient versus newer refrigerators today, so it caused more pollution, right? Automobiles obviously also cause more pollution, right, of a particular sort. And then obviously low-cost international communication, right? Obviously, if we can reach out to people around the globe more cheaply, it increases the speed with which we communicate with folks. But that's also a problem too, right? Because now our personal and our professional lives kind of merge into one another, and perhaps in unhealthy ways, right? Sometimes we have to, in a professional working environment, be ready for a 6 a.m. conference call with people in another time zone. We have to stay late to deal with people in a different time zone, and that can be very problematic to our work-life balance. So one of the things that you'll notice from this discussion is that revolutionary discoveries, like really groundbreaking discoveries, and this is even in people doing PhDs and all this other stuff, are pretty rare, right? Most people that create new inventions or do a PhD are building on the works of others, and they're making more, if you pardon the phrase, evolutional kind of incremental changes in something that's really profound. Those once in a generational top tier inventions or PhD theses are few and far between, to be quite frank with you. And information technology has a long history, right? So, before computers, there were other ways in which we got information, right? There were televisions and radios and the telegraph, and different types of telegraphs. There were electrical telegraphs, and there were mechanical telegraphs. Well, that's with the single post and the flags, and you had people standing on big high towers, right? And they would use these single flags, and across this, they would relay the message from point to point, right? And before you had all this singling type mechanical telegraphs, you had text, and you had books, right? You still have books, right? But books was another way of exchanging information, right? And long ago, it was very expensive to manufacture a book because everything was handwritten and meticulously copied, right? And that was why it was saved for very precious types of works like the Bible and that sort of thing, right? The printed press and all that stuff made a big change there. And if you go before that, there was still oral tradition, right? In terms of the spoken word from one generation to the next. And that's where you saw the greatest utilizations of memorization occurring, and very accurate. People would think that would have been highly inaccurate. As we play the telephone game today, and people's message from one another gets messed up very easily. But that's because we as a society have grown to not depend on memorization activities like people many hundreds of generations before us, in which it was a very important skill and a very well-developed skill. We may have lost it because it's not ingrained into our environment from early age. Doesn't mean it can't be recaptured. People go to great extents to memorize very long works because they're a part of a movie or a play or some sort of other entertainment production, right? So, anyways, Seymour Papert says the wrong question when it comes to computers to ask ourselves is, what will the computer do to us? The right question would be, what will we make of the computer? How will we utilize this technology in the best possible way to benefit our society, if we're being selfless about it? And how will we use, as computing professionals, computers to make this world a better place? Long and short, that's the best question we can ask ourselves at the end of the day. Right? And yes, we want to be able to, as computing professionals, to use computers to provide ourselves with a living, to provide for our families, to help provide for our institutions of faith, right? Through our offerings. That's all important. And we should certainly use computers to that end. But we also want to find ways, how do we make life better for our users, for our clients, for society as a whole. They're wonderful tools, and that's what they are. They are tools. Computers are tools, and we want to utilize them to make life better, not worse for people. So, I'm going to skip this because it doesn't apply to you guys anymore. Alright, so what are some recent technological advances? Alright, well, we all know about smartphones, right? I have a smartphone sitting right here, right? A Pixel 3, right? Not the latest and greatest. Now there's Pixel 4s and Pixel 5s, I guess, coming out. But it's a reasonably capable 2018 flagship smartphone, right? And it does everything I want it to do. I've noticed it's kind of slowed down a little bit over time from all the extra stuff I put on there and software becoming more capable and bulkier, right? It's got a great camera on it for mobile cameras. Sometimes the best camera you have is the one that's with you. And I find it provides tremendous value in my life. I am an amateur photographer, so I appreciate very much modern digital cameras outside of the ones that are on our very high-priced smartphones. SLRs, the single lens reflective, I think that's what SLR is, are very capable devices. They're still better than the cameras on any smartphones. Produce fantastic shots, right? And fantastic video. People use them all the time, you know. They don't use their smartphones so much, you know. Look at all the popular YouTubers. They're going to be using SLR cameras or RED cameras or some sort of other fancy non-smartphone camera to do a lot of their video production work. So, navigation systems in an automobile. Now, granted, a lot of people might take their phone. They use Android Auto or Apple Play. I think that's what it's called on the Apple ecosystem. And use the GPS application of choice in that. But there are dedicated navigation systems in the automobiles. We don't use maps anymore. When was the last time you went and got what is it called, a Tripix map or Tripit? I forget what they call that from the AAA, right? Like, I'm going to take a road trip somewhere. I want the best possible map, and they do a bounded up map of how you get from point A to point B. And this was very useful back in the days before we had smartphones and cellular plans, and you know, or you go to the gas station, you know, buy the big, huge, you know, fold-out maps, right? And you get the highlighter and you figure out a route. Those days seem to be behind us, don't they? The most proactive thing you might do is, if you know you're going to a place with limited internet connectivity, is you might take advantage of the GPS application's ability to download maps if they're not already in the automobile in their entirety, or update them for the ones that are in the automobile. Make sure you have the downloaded maps so that when you hit an area of no coverage, you can still use your car navigation system without freaking out, right? So, because you don't know where you're at or how to go anywhere. So, definitely the ability to read a map has been lost, I think, for you Generation Z folks, right? Your millennial parents might still have some map reading abilities because it was probably still taught for a while, but not all of you. And certainly won't be from my daughter, who is, I don't know, whatever comes after Generation Z, right? So, alright. So, in our information age, we're in sort of this modern era. We're going to see many new technologies emerge, right? We're going to see technologies just come at an increasing clip, and we're going to be profound and amazed at it. We're going to see artificial intelligence technologies emerging to an unprecedented degree. I recently came across using convolutional, or is it not even convolutional, the adversarial neural networks, which is, I think, a form of convolutional networks, where they took Richard Nixon, and of course everyone knows Richard Nixon's famous speech on the first landing on the moon with the Apollo, 11 astronauts and Neil Armstrong and all that, right? And but what people don't realize is he made another speech in case they ended up crashing on the moon, and they wouldn't have been able to have recovered them in that situation. So he made that speech. He never recorded that speech, but he or his team wrote that speech just in case. And someone went back and created a viral video using artificial intelligence technologies of Richard Nixon delivering that other speech. So you could imagine conspiracy theorists might want to use it. You're saying, say we really didn't land on the moon. Someone just took that. Here's Nixon's real speech. They decided not to air it. They decided to use this other one, to make us all believe that man really did land on the moon. But here's him being honest. And in fact, it's really the deep fake. But it's so convincing. I mean, you could tell if you really concentrate on it. But, especially as a computing professional. But to enough people, that video will get them. And that comes with a lot of profound implications. There will be a day and a time where those networks will get so sophisticated where I can take anyone, or you could take anyone, and have them basically say anything. You could take Dr. Spalding and have him say, I think the Suburban's a horrible vehicle. I think the Subaru Ascent is an awesome vehicle. Okay? Now, he would never say that. All right? I only say that because I have a Subaru Ascent as another vehicle for our family, and we love it. We think it's great. We think it's better than a Subaru, in fact. So, but you could take Dr. Spalding and have him say basically what I was saying. I could get on the screen and say all that stuff, and then we can model him because there's enough video, enough voice samples of Dr. Spalding out there to be able to do that. And that's scary. That is really scary stuff. It raises all sorts of ethical issues that we can get into in this course. So, and I think it's a pretty harmless example to get into. So at least I think so. So, all right. And in any event, right, so we have to realize that there's many new technologies that are emerging, and those are just two. We have unprecedented access to information, lots and lots of information, lots of disturbing bits of information that was too much information, right? It's TMI, right? Things that we never wanted to know, right? And there's the visible web, and then there's the big, large, hidden web, and then there's the even, and the not as big but very scary and hidden dark web, right? That we don't want to go near, right? Because it's a place where there's just a lot of very unwholesome materials on there, a lot of illicit activity that takes place, right? It's not a good place to go to, right? Certain people that are researchers in certain areas of information technology might do research in aspects of the dark web, or sociologists might, or that sort of thing, right? Or historians, but it's an area for us to avoid, right? I've done my best to avoid that sort of stuff, so I encourage you to do it too. So, and it is pretty easy to avoid, quite frankly, to avoid the dark web, right? Because you have to set up a proxy and Tor node and all that sort of stuff, and it's not publicly accessible. You have to kind of know the addresses or know where they go, right? So it is not easy to reach. You can if you're motivated, but don't. So, and that's the theme of this course. The low-cost computers, high-speed communication networks is sort of the working theme of this book that has shaped our technology, has shaped technology's impact on society, and how society comes back and then influences computers and communication networks. Right. Examples of control over adoption, right? So when do we pump the brakes, in essence? Well, we've decided to pump the brakes with nuclear energy, for instance, right? So the Chernobyl accident and 3 Mile Island accidents, particularly the 3 Mile Island accident here in the United States in the late 70s, was it? Early 80s, somewhere in that time frame, caused us to just stop the development of any new nuclear plants, right? And I think there might be 1 or 2 that are in active construction now, but people got very afraid of the use of nuclear technology. There's been all sorts of documentaries talking about In some instances, how nuclear energy is very evil. In other cases, how nuclear energy is very safe, and that there's newer technologies in terms of nuclear plants. I'm talking fission-based here, where we can build safe nuclear facilities, and we can keep them from melting down, right? We can design them purposely not to melt down. And yeah, there's still a nuclear waste disposal issue, but we think we can manage that. And so there's 1 or 2 plants, and there's more nuclear plants being built elsewhere throughout the world using your technologies at a greater clip, right? Not in France, not in anymore, and they were a big user of nuclear technology, and certainly not in Japan since the Fukushima tsunami and accident, right? Wiped out a nuclear power plant with a 100-year tsunami, right? But yeah, that was, you could almost forgive that one because that was just such an unprecedented ecological disaster that just no one would have thought of designing for something like that. The other 2 instances of Chernobyl was obviously just gross incompetence. 3 Mile Island was incompetence too, and those are things that could have been mitigated. But we pumped the brakes on it, and China's actually making greater use of nuclear fission technologies. And just in the last several weeks, I had heard that there was the construction of the first nuclear fusion plant, starting with the 2025 completion date, using a Tomahawk reactor design. Now, we all know the myth of nuclear fission, or the issue with nuclear fission, is that you have to put in more power than you can get out. So these people are convinced that somehow that this particular plant design is going to get them to a point where they are power positive, right? Where they're generating more power out than what they start, right? The whole point of fission works for the sun, because you have a big ball of gas under tremendous temperatures and pressure and gravity that just causes fusion to work, right? We don't have that here, so we have to use even more tremendous temperatures and pressure to actually start a fusion-based reaction. And the trick is, can we do that in a way that we get more output than what we put into it to start it, right? So if they can do that, great. We'll have fusion reactors safe to operate, no waste issues, almost essentially perpetual energy, right? Not quite, but pretty amazing stuff if it happens, right? And obviously, we have mechanisms in our society over which we can control the rate at which new technologies are adapted. We can increase or decrease it by how we structure our intellectual property laws and by how we structure our tax structure, right? We give credits and tax credits for research endeavors, right? R&D at corporations, for instance. And that is supposed to stimulate the development of reasonably safe applied technologies, right? But we have governmental agencies like the NSF, which until recently was willing to fund more basic forms of research and higher risk research endeavors, right? So, okay. And obviously, it's a little bit dated since it was from the last course. I know there's an iPhone 11. All right. This is an emblematic product of our information, the black slab of glass, right? That is a smartphone that does many different capabilities, right? It's our internet browser, or MP3 player, or our map navigation app. I forget. There were 3 things when Steve Jobs came out with the very first iPhone. He said it was a 3-in-1 device. And I think I remember 2 of them. I forget what the other one was. Communicator, maybe. And maybe communicator was the 3rd thing. But he had those 3 things. And he said, we have these 3 devices coming out, but really it's in one form factor. I think that was sort of the switch and bait that he pulled, but it was a revolutionary product, the original iPhone, right? And this is just the culmination of all those individual efforts. Right. And obviously it's $1,000 black slate of glass, right? Those smartphone prices, have been increasing, and with the iPhone 11, a top spec'd out phone is $1,500 now, right? So, all right. Technology and values. So there's this dynamic again I mentioned between people and technology. People invent and adapt technology, and technology changes society, and so on and so forth. All right. we can use technology to change people, right? Your book talked at length about how taxi drivers, in order to, and particularly those in London, have to go through this very rigorous process in order to be able to drive a taxi, right? They have to memorize London's very anachronistic street layouts, right? And in the process of memorizing where all the streets and all the stops and all the major landmarks are and so on and so forth, they actually, change how their brain is organized, right? New neural nets are forming and new connections are being formed and other things being pruned away, right? And there's active dynamic changes that occur in the brain that we can image with London taxi drivers. And that's a way in which, they can do that. Now, we also have Uber and Lyft drivers, right? They don't have to go through all those efforts, much to their conventional taxi drivers' anger in places like London. So they depend on their smartphones. And in general, we do have a big dependence on smartphones. And at times an unhealthy one, right? How many times do you go into the restaurant and you see an entire family that's glued to their smartphones for the entire dinner, right? They can pull themselves away for 5 minutes, and maybe they pull themselves away for prayer. I don't know. But you see how that is, right? We tend to be too deep into our phones and not enough on our person-to-person interactions, right? But we're glad to have them, like for situations like a pandemic, right? We have our computers, we have our smartphones. These have been invaluable devices in the midst of a pandemic to have these tools, to be able to maintain some connection to others, right? Think about how much more difficult this pandemic would have been to weather, back in the 80s, right? Think about how tough it was for people back in the flu pandemic of the 1910s, right? When your source communication devices were letter writing, which was the most commonly used, telephones, which were for the rich, right? And only those, it was not something that everybody had. And then you had telegraphs for critical situations or urgent situations or special situations, right? You didn't use those, it was a lot faster than letter writing, but you only use those in special situations because it was expensive, right? So just be aware of that has psychological effects. And we talked about some of the problems that these technologies can bring to us in a little while back, right? So the Amish are selective about technology. Remember, the book talked about what was the overriding criteria for a particular Amish sect to adopt a technology, for the bishop to allow a technology to be done. Does that technology bring us closer as a community, or does it drive us further apart? That's why gas barbecues are okay, right? But automobiles aren't, right? Automobiles tend to distance people and drive people because they tend to travel further instead of staying in their local communities. Anything that's, for the Amish, computers can be okay, right? But they have to be generally, in different Amish sects have varying levels of okayness in terms of computing technology, right? If it is something that's internet connected, you might have an English individual be the interface essentially to that computing device for Amish. A lot of times maybe they're not connected to the internet, right? Maybe they don't even have permanent storage, right? It could be an older device. It could be a Raspberry Pi, right? They could just load a particular program to facilitate a business, for instance, and definitely business-oriented uses only, right? Computers are not found in homes, right? They're not used as part of an entertainment device because that drives people away to be isolated in front of a screen for the Amish, right? But it may be okay for business because it helps conduct a transaction, provide for the family, and it helps bring everyone together because you can more quickly conduct that transaction, so you have more time for your customers or for family, things that are community building aspects. And that's an appropriate area in which to have a computer. So that's just that's just the long and short of what makes technology okay for the Amish versus what doesn't. So, what were the aids to manual calculating way back at the beginning of time, right? So, in the beginning, we had tablets, right? There were clay and wax tablets, right? Cuneiform, we had the cuneiform alphabets of the ancients, right? The Syrians and that sort of thing, right? And then later on, we moved into having slates, right? And those were, chalk-based or some sort of, like charcoal-based writing implement or something like that, right? And eventually we got the paper tablets in the 19th century, right? Not our modern electronic tablets, but these paper tablets, right? They were soft, paper, kind of like in our modern, notebooks that you get when you do pencil and paper exercises, right? And obviously pens came along at some point of varying types, right? From the quill type pens to the mechanical, pens to the ballpoint mass-produced pens that we have today. And then obviously we had abacuses, right? Which were rods or wires in a rectangular frame type device. And they were lines that were drawn on a counting board, right? And we moved these little, pieces to quickly do calculations. Somewhat error-prone, but a lot quicker than counting on our 5 fingers here and our 5 fingers here and our 5 toes there and another 5 toes. That's why base 10, base 5, base 10, base 20 were common number systems in ancient times, because that's as many digits as we had in our hands and feet with which to deal with, right? Other bases were less common, right? Base 2, binary, trinary, base 3, obviously were less common. Base 6 was less common. Base 60 was more common, right? Because now, especially in base 360, right? Because those were angles in a circle or connected to astronomical phenomenon, right? That sort of thing. So, anyways, but eventually we also had the development of mathematical tables, right? And a lot of them in the early days were error-prone. They had to be corrected because they had to be manually calculated, right? And we still have tax tables today, right? You can still go to a library, get our federal or state income tax, booklets, or download them as a PDF from the IRS website, and there'll be tables in them, right? Tax tables. If you want to manually, with pencil and paper, not use a piece of software, you can manually fill out your tax forms and send them in. I did it at one point back in the early 2000s, and then eventually I got tax software, but I remember using those tax tables way back in the day. Yeah. So there was a slate and counting board. In this picture in the book, right? You can kind of see how they, use these various primitive devices for facilitating a more rapid assessment of figures, right? And these were in commerce type activities. This took place. So we had early mechanical calculators. Your book talked a little bit about the work of Blaise Pascal, from which we get the Pascal programming language, right? He's also a mathematician. And he made the first mechanical four-function... no, actually, it wasn't even four-function. Pascal's calculator added and subtracted only, right? And really, he probably could do multiplication and division, because really, what is multiplication but repetitive addition? What is division but repetitive subtraction? All right? But anyways, he did the two-function thing, and was mechanical, and no one thought much of it. And 30 years later, Leibniz come along, right? The guy who gave us sort of our modern calculus notations, right? Among other things. And he did the four-function mechanical calculator, right? But these were unreliable devices. They were better than the manual calculation of tables, right? So there was an improved level of accuracy, but they were mechanical. They were prone to break. They were hard to maintain. They were only for the wealthiest of individuals, right? They could even justify it. And a lot of people said, well, why can't you just do it in your heads? People were probably faster in their heads in a lot of cases than what these devices could do. and then in the 19th century, we had advances in machine tooling that took place, and we had the arithmeter of de Camar, right? That gave us more advanced computing, mechanical computing devices, right? And that was definitely a jump forward and was adopted by the insurance agencies. And then we had the Schlitz printing calculator of the 19th century, and then used methods of differences. Babbage used the methods of differences in his difference machine, which was the actual machine that was built and then later on recreated by others. And there are links on the supplemental resources where you can see a difference machine in operation. And of course, you remember the story with Babbage. Babbage's big long goose chase was in trying to develop an analytical, a general computing purpose device. And it was remarkable, right? All our modern notions of computing devices really originated with Babbage back in the 19th century. The concept of the mill as a memory, right? The concept of a store, right? Or like a silo for memory. The concept of a mill, right, as a computing device. The concept of input and output devices with the copper plates, right? Showing the results of operations, or feeding copper, was it? I forget. I know copper plates were printed on. There were other devices that you fed into it that were essentially the program, right, that the machine used for doing the calculations. And at least for the analytical engines, remember that's where Lord Byron's daughter, Ada Lovelace, right? He hired her to basically develop the first programming language, is essentially for this analytical engine that never got built. So she's regarded as our first programmer, right? And a lot of our first programmers and computing professionals were women, right? And then men kind of came in and kind of co-opted it from the ladies later on for many decades to come, right? And that's only something that we're now correcting in terms of computing as a profession for everyone, for both men and women, and people from all sorts of different backgrounds. Everybody can develop I believe, a computational thinking mindset. I think it is the fourth most important skill to come after reading, writing, and arithmetic that young individuals need to develop. Your children need to develop a computational thinking mindset as a fourth core skill. And as we go through the 21st century and we get into the 22nd century, right? And don't forget, the warp engine was developed in the 2060s. So that Star Trek future is coming sooner than you think. All right, so social change generated a market for calculators, right? So in the Gilded Age, there's all this rapid industrialization that was occurring, right, because of the Industrial Age, and man believed that they can machine their way to any solution, right? And it wasn't all these guilds and this craft work and people working out of their homes. These big, massive factories started to occur, and people traveled into and lived in the cities, and all the stuff that came with urban blight and all sorts of stuff, right? And there was rapid economic expansion, right, with the growing industrial age and concentration of corporate power taking place, right? Not economic power wasn't in these guilds, and more diffuse. It was being increasingly concentrated into an elite class, right? A very large wealthy class, a very large underclass, and at least for a while, a reasonably decent middle class and a growing middle class for a long time. The middle class has kind of stopped growing in recent decades, and it's a shame, right? But that's kind of where we're at right now. And there are new, larger corporations and multiple layers of management and corporations in multiple locations, and they needed up-to-date, comprehensive, reliable, affordable information, right? So, with that said, they needed calculators, for instance, right? And there was a market that developed for these mechanical, and then later on these electrical relay kind of calculators, right? They were kind of mechanical and kind of electrical. And eventually, well into the 20th century, we had, fully electronic calculators. So but it generated there was a fierce market that developed calculators, right? There was a continuous improvement in size and speeds and ease of use, and sales increased rapidly, right? And there was an impact, even with calculators, long before computers ever came along. There was a descaling and feminization of bookkeeping that actually occurred, right? Bookkeeping was once the province of skilled professional men, right? But people of average ability could now take a calculator and do bookkeeping, right? And calculators were 6 times faster than doing adding by hand. So wages dropped, and when the wages dropped, the men became less interested in the industry, but they still needed people to do this stuff, so women were kind of welcomed into it because no one else wanted to do the work, right? Essentially. And that was more so because women couldn't get jobs in other fields where men were interested in, right? Men came in, they wanted those jobs, and other men were willing to give men those jobs. And women just didn't have a chance, right? But they did have a chance in, say, this bookkeeping area, right? Because the men were interested in, but they still needed people to fill the jobs, so there you go. Obviously, not an ideal situation because obviously women were going to be paid less for these bookkeeping professional tasks. Alright, so here are mechanical calculators, right? That, emphasize this descaling and feminization of bookkeeping. So human calculators, essentially. Human computers, if you will, right? So you took a mechanical calculator, an electromechanical calculator, and, bookkeeping activities, and it's a fascinating picture to look at. So. All right. And then eventually we had the development of the first computers. Now, I go into this in a lot more depth in the computer architecture course that many of you have cried your way through, or are about to start to cry your way through. Hopefully it's not that bad this time around. But anyways, we go through a lot of computing history, right? So if you take aside all the efforts of the Ansoff ABC systems or the Zeus systems, or the Colossus in World War II that wasn't made public till many decades later, or the ENIAC and the EDSAC and the EDVAC and all these other systems, right? You take all this and kind of put those systems all aside. The real first commercial system came out of Remington Rand, the UNIVAC, and I think UNIVAC might have been based on the EDSAC system to some extent. And that was the early 50s. That's when our first commercial systems that businesses bought, or governments bought, right? And in this case, the very first one went to the U.S. Bureau of the Census, and it helped to really increase the rapidity with which the census could be done, right? And obviously, it helped to predict the winner of the 52 presidential election. And you saw in the book, it's like they couldn't believe what the computer was telling them. Like, this surely couldn't have been the outcome of the election, right? But it was. But they went back and tweaked the software to make it a lot closer election than it actually really was, right? Everyone thought Dewey had won that election, right? But this computer came along and said, well, no, Eisenhower's going to win it, right? And I believe this is the election we're referring to. If not, oops. But, obviously Eisenhower went away with it, Dewey didn't win it, and there you go. And in any case, IBM, that had sort of a questionable history back in the 30s and 40s with their electromechanical devices with the German government, right, the Nazi government, and helping to facilitate the rapid identification and collection of Jewish individuals for being able to find them and take their possessions and put them into these railroad cards like cattle and send them off to concentration camps along with a bunch of other undesirables and political activists and people that were of had sorts of various medical elements or were homosexual or whatever, right? They rounded them up too and sent them off to concentration camps along with Jewish citizenry. And obviously, their role in that was not a good one, but everyone kind of glossed over that history later on. So there was a larger base of customers, IBM said, boy, we ought to get into this market. And because they had a far superior sales and marketing organization at hand compared to Remington Rand, and they were willing to put in the R&D dollars into this, they came to dominate the mainframe market by the 60s. And Remington Rand went the way of history. Right? And their innovation was the System 360, right? You had a single series of computers of varying capabilities. And they had earlier mainframe systems, essentially, right? They had the 1401, the 7401 for the business and scientific markets, right? They had different capabilities, but they were incompatible with one another. The System 360's mainframe systems were, you could write the software on one, it could run on all of them. That was one of their big, breakthroughs. Although, obviously, if you wrote something for a higher-end model, for a lower-end model, obviously you could easily exceed the memory capabilities and it would crash there. But you could write something on a lower capable device and bring it up to the larger series devices. And it was incredible, right? It was an incredible advancement in computing technologies. They also had this notion of multi-programming, where when one part of the system was working on computational instructions, you have another part of the system loading additional instructions, like, from a punch card system, where you have an output being displayed, right? So that really sped up computations. So, to kind of go along with all this history, we have this notion of the cash register, right? And store owners of the late 1800s faced problems, right? Keeping accurate sales was problematic for various departments. This was the development of these department stores and these malls in the 19th century. And there was also a large issue of embezzlement, right? So you had these cash drawers, right? And people did manual recording of sales transactions, and it was easy for people to overcharge the individual, right, for a particular product, right, or change a price tag easily enough. Person pay more for a product, they could pocket the difference, or maybe they didn't do that. They sold a product to someone and they just put most of the cash in there, but they siphoned some part away to themselves, right? And it was very hard to keep track of all that. So what was the response to this problem? Well, was the cash register, right? It created printed itemized receipts, right, on some sort of primitive paper, right, with an ink on that paper, right, like sort of a mini printing press, essentially. And you could take those receipts and maintain logs, right, and you could cross-reference the receipts to the log to make sure everything lined up. And an interesting innovation of the cash register was that there was a bell that would ring, right? It would ring on every transaction. And it was meant to keep everyone aware that a transaction had occurred, so that everyone would be looking towards that cash register to make sure that that individual wasn't taking cash from that transaction and pocketing into their own personal pocket, right? Literally embezzling at that point of sale. And that was one of the things that brought Dayton, Ohio, an area where I came from and where I grew up, and my father's side of the family grew up, and my mother's side to some extent. That's where they grew up, right? And NCR was one of those historic organizations in Dayton, Ohio, that is, for the most part, no longer there. There might be a little bit of a remnant. I don't even know if there's a customer service component anymore. They may have they were moving out in the aughts to a large extent, and that was very disturbing to the area, right? So the executives had moved, some number of years before, and it was sort of the writing on the wall when they decided to move the rest of NCR, I think, down to Georgia, I think is where they might have moved them. They moved them out of the Dayton, Ohio. It was typical corporate story. Some new regions offering you a bunch of tax breaks if you move your company. So they said, sign us up. And that was it for NCR in Dayton, Ohio. So, but, here's a picture that the book has of them, of people doing shoe polishing in the Dayton, Ohio store. There's a cash register there. And they were pricey devices for their day and time. But they were something. So, and obviously, to kind of go along with the development of the computer, you had these punch cards, right? And obviously, I've already mentioned about how IBM developed a lot of these punch card devices and the electrical type relay type systems, right? They did these calculations, right? These simple calculations. So they did punch cards for inputs. They described how to do the calculation. The calculations were ran on other data cards, and then you had output cards that provided tabulated results, right? So the U.S. Bureau of the Census used them, railroads used them, retail organizations used them, heavy industries used them, the Nazis used them, right, for gathering up their undesirables, right, as they would put it. So, all right, data processing systems, right? You had these tabulators, right? You could have component devices that would receive input data. You could perform one or more calculations and produce output data. The basic IPO algorithm that's used in our modern computing devices. That's a crux of how we teach CSC-1013, right? And really how we teach CS1, right? You get some input data, you perform calculations, and then you have outputs. It's a basic pattern, but it works, right? And even before computers, we had these tabulating devices, right? And we had punch cards that were the crux of these devices, right? We had punch cards for inputting the data. We had punch cards for describing how to work on the data themselves, right? And we also had we could put that data on punch cards or paper tape or some sort of magnetic tape if we wanted to. It was pretty good stuff. And I've mentioned before about how IBM was involved in the Holocaust, right? And how Germany and the Nazi government made use of IBM's technology, right, to facilitate their political ends. And it's a pretty sad story. And it's a sad story in IBM's history. It's a sad story all around, right? And you know, it's just sad. So, all right. Milestones in computing. So you have precursors to the commercial computers. I mentioned a few of these a few minutes ago. You had the Addensoft-Berry computer, the ABC computer, involving the use of vacuum tubes. So before you had integrated circuits, right? And the transistors on a silicon die, and you had just transistors. And before you had just transistors, you had vacuum tubes as our basic computing element. And you used the vacuum tubes to form relays and digital circuits and that sort of thing. And they were very unreliable, but they were a computing device. And from the ABC system, you had the ENIAC with externally programmed wires. So the ABC computer had one dedicated purpose, and that was the only thing you could do with it. The ENIAC was externally programmable with jumper cables and relays and vacuum tubes, and it was so cumbersome, but you could at least reprogram it, right, with these moving around all these jumper cables and stuff. The EDVAC improved on the ENIAC because now you had a program that was stored in memory, right? And then there was also the small-scale experimental machine with its CRT memory, right? So, each of these generations scaled things up. So the ENIAC, which really wasn't operational before the end of the war, was finished in 1946. But it could let a person do a 60-second trajectory, because that's what it was built. The ENIAC was built to calculate ballistics tables, right? It could do a 60-second trajectory. Okay. Let me put it this way. So a person doing a 60-second trajectory, it would take that person to build that table 20 hours, right, of work. The ENIAC could do it in 30 seconds. Well, it took a person 20 hours before. So it was a 2,400 factor speed. It was incredible. Had we had the ENIAC back during the war, who knows? It would have really sped up our progress with being able to calculate these tables. Our operations would have been a lot more efficient. We could have did much more rapid updates of ballistics calculations based on enemy movements. Fewer casualties on our end. Probably more casualties on our enemy's end. We probably would have made more rapid gains. Would have prevented things like the use of the atomic bomb. Who knows? It might have prevented our use of it. It might have, in some cases, sped up our land invasions of, like, Japan, right? Which could have ejected more, we might have saved some casualties on one end, accelerated casualties because we might have mounted a land-based invasion because the atomic bomb wouldn't have been there yet, right? We could have ended the war in 44. it's really fascinating to think about what might have been, right? Had a system like the ENIAC been available. Now, Colossus was working during this time, right? Because it was taking the Enigma, German Enigma machine calculation, communications, and decoding those and helping our allies out. That also had a big, profound effect in being able to end World War II more quickly. Now, obviously, wasn't in time to preclude the use of atomic weapons, at least for in the Pacific theater. Obviously, it helped particularly in the German theater, right? Enigma wasn't of much use in the Pacific theater, but it did help in the European theater with being able to shorten the war there. So the Colossus was a computing device, and it had a profound impact. And who knows, if the ENIAC had been around for, say, the Pacific theater, it could have made an impact there. Who knows? What are the other important characteristics of these systems? Well, the ENIAC did not have a stored program concept. Everything had to be hardware. So I talked about those jumper cables. Reprogramming took days, but it could be done. All right, and give you those quick results. The EDVAC had discrete variable automatic memory, and that's why you said your program could be stored in memory along with the data. And that was a profound advancement. So that's, but Babbage had a notion of a stored computer concept. Back in the 19th century, it wasn't really realized until the EDVAC. Okay. And here's an example of the ENIAC. Without having that programmable stored memory, you see all these jumper cables being switched between these relays, right? And it was a very cumbersome activity. And notice that women are doing this activity. The professional male engineers are not doing this activity. It was a laborious activity. They would have specified how everything should be laid out, and they would have sent the women, the human computers, off to do it. So, there you go. I mentioned that before. Sorry for the replication. And again, here's a picture of the 52 presidential election using the UNIVAC. So, pretty amazing stuff there. So, all right. So, let's talk a little bit about programming languages. So, obviously, in the early days, everything was machine code to the machine's instruction set architecture, right? You had to know the ones and the zeros, or the decimal equivalents. For there were some of those earlier systems I mentioned were decimal, not binary based. And eventually, people came along and said, "Wow, this is not great. This is very hard to use." So people developed assembly language, which are symbolic representations of machine instructions, right? So one-for-one translation from the assembly language to the machine language, right? The programs were just as long as the machine language, but it was done in a more human-friendly, readable manner, right? And then eventually, people like Grace Hopper and whatnot developed higher-level programming languages, right? So, for an example, would be Fortran, right? Formula translation for scientific computing endeavors, right? And then here, one instruction translated the many assembly instructions, which corresponded to many machine instructions. And then we also had COBOL, right? A common business-oriented language or something along those lines, if I remember my acronyms. And that was a U.S. Department of Defense. You couldn't sell a system to the Department of Defense, that they would use in their procurement material acquisition systems, right? That places like Patterson Air Force Base is known for instance, if you did not have a system that could run COBOL, right? It had to be designed to do it. And it found a lot of popularity in business applications. So, you had time-sharing systems that emerged later on, right? So, instead of you taking your big stack of punch cards to a computer room, giving them to a computer operator, or doing it yourself, or you take a set of cards, right? You put in the programming language card deck first, because there were no operating systems initially. It'd load up the programming language. You put in your source code cards. It basically, generate your computer program from those cards, a binary blob, right? And then once your blob was there in memory, then you could load your data cards in, right? That had all the data you wanted to operate on. And it'd take your program, your data cards, it'd generate output, and then it would generate that output somehow on some sort of output device. And that was problematic. It was very laborious and time-consuming, and if you had any errors, it was a lot of effort to fix them, right? So eventually these time-sharing systems were developed at like MIT based on the PDP systems and whatnot. And it allowed multiple users to use a single system at the same time. And there was a time division multiplexing that occurred. So computers could connect via terminals, allowed the cost of ownership to be spread among more people, and gave rise to many more people accessing computers. That obviously gave rise to a need for operating systems and the notion of users and discrete resources, right? And later on, out of it, we got things like the basic programming language, right, which was developed at Dartmouth. And they were easier to use programming languages than Fortran and COBOL, and became popular for helping people to learn how do you go about using a programming language in a computer. It was a good learning language. And you could actually develop a lot of games and business applications, and you could do scientific computing even with it. It wasn't fast scientific computing, but it was computing. And it opened in these program, and BASIC could be used on simpler devices. People would do proof of concepts on lower end mini computers, right? So after mainframes came mini computers, and from mini computers came personal computers, right? Now on these more simple devices, and some of which were time shared, in the mini computer, obviously personal computers weren't necessarily time shared, but mainframes and mini computers were. People could do their proof of concepts on lower end devices, and then once things were proven out and it was safe to be able to use these devices on the more expensive equipment, they could do that. Right. So vacuum tubes, I mentioned, were used in a lot of early systems, and then along the way came a need to go from relay type systems to vacuum tubes, and then eventually in the late 40s and the transistor which was a great advancement in computing devices. A transistor is a simple device. It lets you basically have it's an electrical device that either lets electrons flow through or don't flow through, and it's a two-state device essentially. There are three-state devices, right? But for all purposes, you let an electron through. It represents one electrical state. It could be a 1 or a 0. Or you don't let that electron through, which could represent the other version of a 1 or a 0, right? When you have those two electrical states represented, you have the ability to represent a binary number system. And there you go. You can do any type of computing application possible with those two states. And transistors were faster and cheaper and more reliable and energy efficient. And we could package these transistors up into these, because they were semiconducting devices, right? They were on silicon substrates. Right? And I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not a computer engineer. My knowledge of these types of devices is limited, right? So eventually we could take these transistors, we packaged them together in something called the integrated circuit. So a bunch of transistors were on a silicon substrate. We put in some ceramic die package, and we combined it with other things like capacitors and resistors and diodes and all sorts of other electrical engineering devices to create integrated circuits, to create printed circuit boards that did all sorts of things that interacted with other integrated circuits. And they were continually faster and faster and smaller and more reliable, and they got less and less expensive, and they just enabled all sorts of new applications. So the predecessor to Intel was Fairchild Semiconductor, right? And you had all these great minds here working on the first integrated circuits, right? Following the invention of the transistor. And a few of these individuals here broke away, went off, and formed their own company called Intel, right? And it's a great little story in its own right. So notice all the male engineers here, by the way. If you like great historical pictures, right? They're doing the serious work, sitting there and talking about things. and you notice the women are at all these different terminals in the background and in the foreground here, and they're operating all these computing devices, or they're operating test equipment, or other benches, right? Or they're helping to fabricate ICs, right? And there you go. They're doing the mundane work, right? That these male engineers can be bothered to deal with themselves while they're sitting around. So it's a great picture. It has obviously changed for the better. So sorry about yawning. I've been going for a while in this video, right? And then I mentioned earlier on in this particular session about the System 360 and how they came to dominate the mainframe market, because before that, even computers from IBM incompatible with one another. You had to switch computers, you had to rewrite the programs for the instruction set architecture of that computer. So the System 360 was a series of 19 computers of varying levels of power. All computers could run the same program. You could upgrade without rewriting your software. Awesome. Right? And here is an example of an IBM System 360 in work. There's some great video links, I think, in the supplemental resources that you can do. Right? And I mentioned transistors, integrated circuits to basically microprocessors, right? Which is sort of the next jump, which is basically a semiconductor in a packaging, fancy packaging, right? That you could pop onto a printed circuit board, right? And then microprocessors came in the early 70s at Intel, which came out of Fairchild Semiconductor, right? And eventually Busicom came. They wanted this calculator with all these custom chips on it. They convinced them to do this sort of general purpose, processor from Intel. They did it. Intel said, "Whoa, we have something special here. Like, we'd like to pay you back all this money you gave us to develop this chip if we could just reuse this for other applications." And the people at Busicom said, "Well, yeah, we got our calculator. Go ahead, knock yourself out. You want to give us the money back? Great. We just saved all our development cost." They didn't realize what Intel had planned to do with us, and the rest is history. With the Intel 4004, and then the 8008, and then the 8080 and the 8086, and so on and so forth. Right? So, and then along this time, as Intel was developing these processors and the first personal computing devices were coming out, you had all sort of these information technology developments occurring. You had the whole Earth catalog, and it was sort of like Google in paperback form, right? It was the quote from Steve Jobs. And Stuart Brand saw the technology as a tool for the individual and collective transformation, right? Based on a quote from Fred Turner. And these were a lot of hippies, but they saw the power of technology to transform, right? And to free things from the elites of the time, right? Although all this ended up back in the hands of the elites later on, so there you go. Because of the economic opportunities that came with these technologies. But in the meantime, with the hippies and the whole Earth catalog, you had the People's Computer Company being developed. And a lot of these documents, I think you can probably find on like the archive.org if you look enough. A lot of these newsletters and that sort of thing, right? It came from things like the People's Computer Company, right? And basically they wanted to have these newsletters to educate people on how to use computers. And they also had these locations where you could go and timeshare computers, basically. You pay a small amount of money, you could get on a computer, you could write your software, you could build your software, you could see how it worked. You could take the software other people wrote, have it built and then run it. And it was great. It was a culture that promoted the free exchange of software. So long before GitHub and the open source software movement, you had people doing the People's Computer Company, or they had people doing magazines and newsletters where they published their source code. You could take it and build it and run it, and they could contribute back, right? Through either going to these meetings, or by doing, contributing to these publications or whatnot. It was great. In the Homebrew Computer Club, especially in the Silicon Valley area, and that's why Silicon Valley became so popular, people went to these computer clubs, and it was a meeting place for hobbyists, right? That's where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak showed up, right? With their Apple I system, right? And the Apple I isn't the Apple II. The Apple II was this nice professional-looking product. The Apple I was this hobbyist put-it-together system on your own, literally made out of ICs and microprocessors on wood. So, there was a printed circuit board. I shouldn't be so critical of it, but there was a lot of wood involved in terms of the housing, right? All this equipment, right? We can see that here, right? Literally, everything was, there's a display there that they wired up, but the Apple One, which is the circuit board here, right, was that was the Apple One, right? This is what was sold to hobbyists, right? This thing here is what was sold to hobbyists. People had to buy this keyboard separately and this display separately and wire them up themselves. They had to basically put all the chips in themselves, right? They literally had to build this computer themselves. There may have been, I don't know if Apple did it, if Jobs and Wozniak, they may have or may not have put it together for others. But, like the Meets Altair and this Apple One, people had to put this stuff together themselves. So, that was just the hobbyist aspect of the time. All right. And at this point, I'm going to break from the video, and the next video will be the milestones in networking.